Sri Lanka are employers' liability. That means it is on the private sector, on the employer entirely to pay for maternity leave benefit. We've learned as well is that unemployment rates for women between 20 and 40 is extremely high in Sri Lanka.
Having more women in the workforce could lead to 12 trillion in terms of volume of GDP globally. And for Sri Lanka, we're talking about 20%. And that's a huge number.
If you listen to the budget speeches, normally they want to have quick fixes. They will give microfinance to women, or they will help them open up some job. But all of these are like vulnerable jobs. You can't earn good money with those.
Welcome to another episode of She Slays, and today we are looking at designing employment laws to endanger higher female labor force participation. Joining me in the studio is a panel comprising of Aarthy Arunasalam, Country Gender Lead Sri Lanka at the International Finance Corporation. Nisha Arunatilake. Nisha is the Director of Research at the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. And Nishana Weerasooriya is the Deputy Head Legal Research for Verite Research. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
So I'll start with a question that keeps bugging me. Policymakers keep wanting to increase the rate of, female participation in the workforce. I think it's a laudable move, considering it's so much lower than male participation rate in this country. I think the more important, more pertinent issue really is to do this in tandem with creating decent jobs, right, for both men and women. How can we do both when we have failed, particularly in the rate of participation as well?
So if you listen to the budget speeches, normally they want to have quick fixes. They will give microfinance to women, or they will help them open up some job. But all of these are like what ILO calls vulnerable jobs. They don't earn good money. You can't earn good money with those. And they don't come with social protection. So you need to do some hard work to create good jobs. And when I say that, what you need to do is really invest in industries that will create decent work. And you need to also know the composition of your labor force. So there are good jobs in Colombo, Western Province, in the finance sector, IT sector, and the garment sector. The government gives good jobs. But you need to be educated. You need to have a tertiary level education to access a lot of those jobs. So 60% of the people are living outside of Western Province, and they are low skills. So really you need to target jobs for those people. Invest in agricultural productivity or improving manufacture industries, all these things. So, yeah.
Interesting.
I couldn't agree more with what Nisha's saying. But I think what's also really important, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, is, when we're talking about decent work, what are we talking about, right? I think it's really about safe working environments, but also secure employment, right? And one of the things that I think we need to understand a little bit more in Sri Lanka is that the low female labor force participation rate is also very much rooted, ingrained social and cultural expectations of what a woman should be doing for work and where they should be working, right? So we can definitely create more jobs, and that's a fantastic way to go. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more. But really understanding why women are not taking up work as well is also so very important to really answer this question in a meaningful way.
If I were to add,
Please.
and then two very interesting angles, right? So I think in today's context, women are disproportionately impacted predominantly due to crisis, right? And the twin crisis that's going around. And even if you look at it globally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and et cetera, that's all happening around the world. And then there's also this other bucket, which we need to start talking about, is the climate crisis and how women are going to be impacted. In another 10 years, if we do not take this and tackle this seriously, there's going to be more than 130 million people who are going to hit the poverty line. So we need to do something to tackle it immediately. And a few strategies that we can work around is, one thing is definitely to build a business case. And I think some of the work both Nishana and Nishani spoke about was in these lines. And I think Sri Lanka has built the business case, but we really need to start out walking the walk, if I were to put it. We've spoken enough, right? Now let's do the work.
That is so true, because we have enough policies on how to do this, but it's not been implemented. So we really need to.
Absolutely.
And you spoke about the creating an enabling environment. And I think here it's about firm level, market level, and at a country level, right? And how can we rally with multiple partners, stakeholders, private, public sector, all coming together towards moving towards this key goal. And I think there's also very importance that we need to bring in when it comes to gender-focused investment, a subject that we don't talk much. The reason why we need to do this, it's important that gender gets mainstreamed into business and performance standards so that it can be more inclusive and actionable. So for example, things like sustainable linked finance, blended financing, gender bonds. So these are great products where gender is core as a part of an instrumental investment solution.
Interesting. I'm going to explore something more with you, Aarthy, than what you said. The successive governments really have looked to the private sector, as an engine of growth. And you were mentioning about looking at it from, different levels, both as an individual firm, as a country, and, even as a society. But we both know, really, corporates and their shareholders look at return on investment as the key investment criteria in anything, right? From whatever that IFC has done and your experience globally, how can the boards and the CEOs justify this kind of investment with their shareholders? And also, I think just to add something, in particularly in the West, there seems to be sort of like a reversal of this movement where, diversity, inclusion is under attack, really. And schemes targeted particularly towards either gender or race is being invalidated by courts and so many other ways. So how do we justify this, to shareholders so that the private sector can really take I think at a leadership level, they really do want to invest, but then getting that sign off from shareholders could be a challenge.
And it's interesting, you want to know what's happening globally and versus Sri Lanka as well. And I would say global studies mirrors what happens in Sri Lanka, period. So it's the same narrative that's going around. So when you have a diverse workforce, that leads to better performance. When it's better performance, your employees are happy, it boosts business productivity and growth, period. So having more women in the workforce could lead to 12 trillion in terms of volume of GDP globally. And for Sri Lanka, we're talking about 20%, right? And that's a huge number, right? And so this is the overall workforce. Now, talking about the investors and what's the return on investment for these, for the folks, if you were to put it, is there was a study we did with the Colombo Stock Exchange, and we looked at the top 30 performing organizations in the listed companies. And all the companies which had a diverse board in terms of performances, it was higher when it comes to return on equity, return on assets, and the other performing standards as well, right? But interestingly, so very recently, we rang the bell at the Colombo Stock Exchange, where Nisha was also a part of it. And
because symbolism counts.
It does. And the reason why we ring the bell is across 120 stock exchanges is to really talk about this. And it's important that we need to have more diverse boards. And this time it was very critical that we need more diverse boards, especially in a resilient economy like ours, right? And for the first time, the diversity ratio had dropped from 10.1% to 8.7%. So we've gone back to where we were back in 2017 in terms of tracking. So what are the reasons? I think some of the cases that we discussed, it's the economic crisis. There's a huge amount of brain drain that's happening in the market. But I think there's a little bit more that and when I say a little bit more is we have to take very strong stance and have those honest conversation, which is going to be really tough. But those are important with the professional corporate governance bodies, with the regulators, so that we have a good talent pipeline that's coming in, ready to be on the boards. And also at the same time, we have the right regulations, especially things like introducing a soft progressive quota will help us shift the needle. And I think we're at a scenario where we need to really move from survive mode to thrive mode. And the sooner we do it, the better it is.
Including women is not only the right thing to do. It is actually the smart thing to do. Because if you look at the population, more than half the population is females. And, if you are a business, you are catering to women as well. So it is important to know how, from a women's perspective, it is good business.
They are the decision makers in most households globally, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it is good business. It is not just the right thing to do. It is the smart thing to do. Yeah.
Interesting. Just want to explore something else with you. Nisha, it's about access. And we know that one of the reasons why, the female participation rate is lower here is that there are laws and regulations that discriminate against women, clearly discriminate against them, and that is an access problem. I know because I used to run a trade chamber that we used to in the IT BPM industry, and we used to have huge issues in terms of certain working conditions. What specific laws do you think we need to address now and going forward in terms of increasing the participation rate of females?
Yeah, so I'm going to step back a little bit on your question. So it's really the problem is the lack of laws. 2/3 of our workforce is working in the informal sector. They are not at all covered by laws at all. So however much you improve the laws, that's not going to affect 2/3 of the workforce.
Agreed.
So of the other 1/3, even the existing laws are not properly implemented. So a lot of them are again not covered. In saying that, let me answer your question as well.
No.
So the World Bank comes up with this Women, Business and Law Index. So we don't do very well in that. We score like 65.5 out of a possible 100 points. So one of the reasons is we have certain laws that are there in other countries. It's not existed in Sri Lanka. For example, there is no law preventing discrimination in the workplace.
Right.
And also there is no law which says that men and women should be paid equal wages for equal types of jobs done. So those kind of laws are not there. So that's why one reason why we are scoring very low. Another reason is certain laws don't treat men and women equal.
I think there's a prohibition itself after 6 p.m. for certain industries.
Yeah, night work. Yes. And the third reason is the design of the laws are also there are problems. For example, the maternity benefits. That's the responsibility of the employer to provide that. And obviously that's a big cost. So they will think twice before employing a young woman.
Agreed.
So that's the third thing. And of course, even the existing laws are not being implemented. So that is also a big barrier. So we need to correct all of that. Yeah.
Do you think that some of the reasons that these laws are not updated is simply because in terms of benefits, it actually does benefit certain segments and therefore they are resistant? Or is there ignorance in terms of general, as a society, we don't see the value of these, that, it's not really a problem that needs to be addressed? For example, equal pay. It may be more ignorance or than really setting out to discriminate.
Like I said earlier, the bigger problem is not a large number of people not being covered by any kind of law.
Interesting.
So there are bigger problems. That very first question you ask about creating decent work, formal employment, which will ensure that people are covered by the legal system. We need to improve that first.
How do other countries do it that have large informal sectors? I mean, they must be tackling it in some way as well.
So interestingly, now Peru, I was just involved in a study where Peru was also in that. They do really well in this Women, Business and Law Index, 95% out of a possible 100. But there are problems. Like I said, because
Nobody's
of the large informal sector, but the laws not being implemented and all of that. But at least, they have a way of looking for redress if there is some problem. But here, It's not even that.
And I want to tackle this in depth a little bit later as well, and the societal framework that sort of allows this to thrive in this country.
Yes, exactly.
But before that, I want to come to you, Nishana, and we don't talk enough about this, but discrimination, harassment in the workforce, right? So it's not just a legal issue, it's also a productivity issue. And from your experience globally, how do other countries tackle it, and what can we learn from them?
No, great question. I think I'm going to start with what Nisha mentioned, which is on maternity leave benefits. So I think when we're looking at discrimination and harassment, I would say there are two main areas that we can kind of look at and kind of implement easily enough, right? So the first is like, how are women prevented or discriminated against from entering the workforce in general, right? And that really comes down to the fact that maternity leave benefits in Sri Lanka are employers' liability. That means it is on the private sector, on the employer entirely to pay for maternity leave benefits, right? I think in Sri Lanka it's 3.5 months, if I'm not mistaken, right? And what we've learned as well is that unemployment rates for women between 20 and 40 is extremely high in Sri Lanka. And those are the really childbearing, years as well. And there is, if I'm not mistaken, a survey done by the Department of Census, which actually confirms this bias where companies are reluctant to hire women because of the higher cost associated with women, right? And I think that's incredibly, sad given the state of Sri Lanka, right? And what's even more interesting, coming to your question, is Sri Lanka has ratified C-103, which is the Maternity Leave Benefits Convention from ILO. And that actually requires that maternity leave is either paid from social insurance or through public funds. But it also says it should not be employers' liability solely, right? Sri Lanka, when compared to other counterparts, we really are an outlier, right? So 192 countries, 194 countries in the world, right? Give or take. 33 of them, states fully fund maternity leave benefits. And 96 partially fund. So that's 129 approximately. So Sri Lanka is really in kind of that lower side where they are not funding maternity leave benefits. And in terms of the, I think Nisha said, we need to do, now is the time, right? And it's a smart thing to support women and invest in women. And when it comes to this, state funding of maternity leave benefits is very doable, right? It's not rational to not make this a priority for Sri Lanka, especially when the economic benefits are so incredibly high. I think, we spend a lot more on a lot of other things, right, in terms of government expenditure. We did a calculation on this, and I think in 2022, we determined that approximately 1% of government expenditure would be sufficient to cover maternity leave benefits for the private sector. So the percentage is very low and very doable for the government. So that's the first thing, right? In terms of the second thing, it's really looking at sexual harassment at the workplace and how do we define it, right? Discrimination. In other countries, Imran, what we've seen is when it comes to this, it goes back to what we call vicarious liability, right? So in Sri Lanka, sexual harassment at the workplace is only identified in the penal code. So that means it has to be so severe to require penal sanctions. But as we all know, some sexual harassment in the workforce is not always at that level that we want to even say that it requires penal sanctions, right? I think, Aarthy mentioned some things need to be, it can be addressed within the workplace in the private company itself, right? How management is handling, how HR is handling those policies, right? It doesn't need to get to that level. So one of the things that happens with vicarious liability is that the company ends up being liable for unlawful discrimination, as Nisha was mentioning, or harassment by its employees unless the employer has taken all reasonable steps necessary to prevent that type of conduct, right? And many other countries have kind of turned to that, especially with C-190, which is a sexual harassment convention that was recently, it's kind of, groundbreaking, in terms of the ILO convention, and it's fantastic. And it would really go a long way in terms of Sri Lanka being a signatory to that. But also more important than that, that is actually creating these laws and mechanisms for women and, LGBTQI community, vulnerable communities, people with disabilities, to be able to have redress when it comes to harassment and discrimination in the workforce.
Interesting.
If I may add to that, and there was this recent study we conducted. It's where we worked with close to around 9 companies, and the cost to businesses due to sexual harassment, bullying, or online violence translates into $1.7 million per year. That's a significant amount.
Yes.
And when we really looked at, when we say sexual harassment and bullying, you automatically think it's going to be women. No.
Yeah.
But the numbers were 3 out of 5 people said that they were either bullied, harassed, or are facing online violence. And persons with disability, the ratio for them to be going through GBVH was a lot more higher. And one of the things we did was we built a survivor-centered training approach. It's a very short 4 days. When I say 4 days, it's 2 hours each, but very easy tools so that employers are able to kind of implement it. So that's something we kind of rolled out, and we reached more than, I would say, 300,000 employees through that. And we have local partners like Diversity Collective Lanka, and we have many more local partners who are going to be onboarded soon, who will be driving this for us from the forefront. And it's interesting, Nishana spoke about C190, is these particular, I would call it as evidences, or it's working in organizations, right? And these are important, are great inputs that will go into the C190, and conversations have happened. There's been 3 roundtables that we have been a part of, but I think there's a lot more push that really needs to happen. And if this kicks off as a first round, this will be a better bet rather than the proper legal legislation policies that could come as it comes.
Yes, as it comes.
So yeah, I mean, that's what is being found in other countries also. When the laws are so difficult, the litigation is so costly.
Exactly.
Women don't come forward.
Yeah.
I mean, they just leave the job. I
Yeah.
mean, that's their way of the solution. is
Handling
leave the
it,
job.
right?
handling it.
No, but it really needs to be a situation where companies need to really take this seriously, right? And what we say is it's not one size fits all, right? You can't expect a multinational company to have the same recourse or mechanisms or investigation or policies as an SME, right? Because we want to encourage business, but also ensuring that women are not discriminated against, right? And how do we support this group? And so having those policies and a transparent policy is so important for the private sector. Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. I also think it's actually not an excuse anymore. It doesn't have to, the size of the company should not matter, because the toolkits available, the resources available are, I think, at a historically high level, right? Online, with also practitioners who've done it. I really don't think it's an excuse anymore about whether the company is large, small, whether it's an MNC or local company. Discrimination is discrimination, and there are enough of resources today to sort of, work on it. So I think there's no excuses anymore. Some very fascinating insights so far, but I think I think the big bear in the room, if it were, was actually more than any laws or policies. It's this society that we live in, right? That has been there for a long time, that nobody seems to want to change, but has gone through some massive crisis, right? And I think there's not much of hope for the future of this country. It's a very patriarchal society. It's very clear. And I think expectations lead from that onwards towards roles, and and that also leads to some of these, not some, I think a lot of the discrimination, a lot of the pay, gaps, and so on. How do we change this?
The big question, huh?
This is the elephant in the room.
Yeah. I will start off, and I would love for Aarthy and Nisha to kind of come in here. I think, we talk about all the time education, right? And kind of starting at the education level. And I agree with that, definitely. But I think it's also important for us to understand Sri Lanka, right? And Sri Lanka is not a monolith. We are a multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic country. And so each of our kind of microcosms, each community, also comes with its own kind of cultural kind of background. And, there's baggage there as well, right? And so I think it's also important that we tailor kind of what we're doing in terms of the education system as well to understanding those nuances, because without that, it's going to be difficult to really get anywhere. The other thing that I want to say is I don't think that Sri Lanka is alone when it comes to having a patriarchal society. I think that other countries also have this in place. And despite laws in place, despite kind of being so progressive, whether it's the European Union, the US, Australia, there is still challenges for women to come forward when it comes to harassment or discrimination, right, in the workplace, because there's always questions of how a woman is seen, right? Are you that person, And for women, working is a way for them to have independence, right? And so making sure that we are protecting that is also really important. But I do think that, the question is a big one. I think education is definitely a start to that. And starting small, right? I think understanding that as an individual, as a parent, right, you have a responsibility as well to teach your young boys, right? What it means to be respectful and understanding, right? It's not always about, teaching your daughters, be careful about this. Don't go out at night. What about this? It's about teaching our children as well, right? So it's an individual responsibility there as well. But I'll stop.
Yeah. So for me, the bigger problem is actually this social norms, which has determined different gender roles. So women are left with, Aarthy, I know she does a lot of work in there. They are responsible for taking care of the household, the children, if they are elderly, those people. So they are busier people at home. So accessing work in this environment is not easy. So this is one of the reasons. And also there are other norms. One reason also, the laws are being written by mostly males. I was surprised to find actually EPF, once you get married within a certain time, usually people get married in their early 20s. Women can withdraw your retirement funds because what is expected is that they will stay at home and look after them. That was so shocking.
I've actually had employees who've done that because they don't think that the EPF or ETF will survive in the long term.
That's a different problem.
This is what they will do. So other than these social norms in the household restricting women, actually I was involved in a study which looked at that with the Partnership for Economic Policy funded by Co-Impact. So, that is affecting the supply because they are so busy. But it is actually interesting to see that the demand for work, the employers also internalize this. So at recruitment, if you are interviewing a young person,
definitely,
they are thinking, okay, is she going to ask for maternity leave? Is she going to cost the if you have a choice between a male and a female, and then you're going to lean towards, because it makes business-wise, it's less costly to hire the female. So those are the other things actually, and it not only at the recruitment level, but promotions also, because if you are a manager, you have to sometimes stay after work hours. And, that's a problem. And we also find that women are less likely to participate in labor unions.
Absolutely.
Because they just don't
problem.
have the time to, and they won't take leadership positions. So it's a big problem. So I think to answer your question is some of the work that Aarthy is doing. You need to have affordable quality in the short term, I think, childcare, so that burden is lessened for the women, and also maybe elderly care and other kind of support to reduce the burden in the short term. But in the longer term, of course, you need to educate and change these biases. But
particularly, you've written about this law. If you're a mother, child under 2 years, you can't go for overseas employment, but that doesn't apply for the father. And the question arises, why should it apply to anybody? Because it's a basic fundamental right of you deciding whether you want to go overseas or not. But I don't see the pushback from females in society against this law. I've read media commentary where they have interviewed, females who say, oh, that's actually a good thing because, then the child is, at formative stage is important. So I think there's a lot we have to do about many areas.
One important thing is bystander interventions are are important. And what I mean by that is to speak up. Very recently, I can speak about an incident where there was a few of us and very senior stakeholders. And one of the stakeholder actually made this comment saying that asking the colleagues go sit in front so that it adds some color. And the women around started giggling. And I was right in the middle, right? So I was like, what is going on? And it was an opportunity for me to speak up. I could have kept quiet because it's none of my business. But when I questioned, I said that was a very inappropriate comment. And I don't understand what's funny and why did you say that? And then immediately the women understood that it was also not acceptable and they spoke up. And that's where those stereotypes...
Somebody has to start.
So important bystander training. Couldn't agree more.
Exactly. And that's where that really kind of comes into play. But I think beyond that, when you look at it from a workplace, how IFC really drives it is through the business case. So having a more accessible, flexible workplace, safe, inclusive environment. And how we do that is through multiple practices. And we actually implement it on the ground with organizations. And that's where that really brings it all together.
Great. I just want to come to you. Nisha mentioned something about the fact that a large part of our workforce works in the informal sector. And so however much we have an absence of laws, but the second thing is even if you do have those laws, implementation is a challenge, right? And with the large informal sector, that's even bigger problem. So implementation is actually quite key, even the few laws that we do have, to make sure that, the kind of discrimination is eliminated and the kind of opportunity increases. Now, how do we do this? What are the steps that we need to take across the chain of operation? Right, this is a very complicated ecosystem that we work with.
No, great question, Imran. So I think first and foremost, definitely identifying and regulating the actual relationship between informal sector is first and foremost. And domestic workers are kind of at the heart of that for me. But to answer your question on implementation, I think, when you're looking at the laws, understanding there's a whole plethora when it comes to discrimination and labor laws, and also when it comes to the IDA, the Industrial Disputes Act, right? I'm going to specifically look at sexual harassment for this particular question. And for that is within the penal code, right? I mean, there is sexual bribery in the Anti-Corruption Act, but that's only against public officials, not private sector, right? So if we're looking at the penal code, I think, when we're looking at the purpose of it, I mean, just to get out there, it is really about accountability and justice for victims, right? But the problem with the penal code, as we all know, there are entrenched barriers within the penal code to access justice. And it's not new information, right? And those relate to whether it's delays in justice, not enough judges, the cost in terms of actually going through with the case, the time of the case that it takes to finish a case, right? At the police station, when victims do go forward or survivors do go forward, the kind of cultural stigma, so the re-victimization that occurs within that space. So Supreme Court case, the Manahara case, that actually outlines the procedural challenges as well when it comes to these cases, right? So question I'm going to pose is it about capacity or is it about willingness to kind of implement these laws, right? And I think the other thing that we've looked at and the challenges to address sexual harassment in particular in the penal code is that, as I've mentioned earlier, the penal code should only be there for the most severe type of harassment. So not all types of harassment fall in there, right? So quid pro quo, for instance, right? Retribution. That does not always fall within the ambit of the penal code, nor do we want to kind of encourage individuals to be going through the criminal justice system. So in implementation, really the answer is we need to find an alternative route. Right? And so for that, it really is the civil liability space, right? How do we look at alternative dispute resolution as a mechanism, right? And how do we improve that when it comes to these types of disputes, these types of challenges, right, that women are facing? Because going to court is not going to be something that is going to be, at the forefront of women who are working, right? As Nisha mentioned, we have a whole bunch of other things that we are trying to handle, right? So I think the question on implementation of the law, it really comes down to capacity and willingness.
Aarthy, Nisha, you want to add something to that?
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, I wouldn't go to the courts because
Yeah.
I just can't afford it to
Yeah.
start with. And, I can't wait for years and years. It's not practical at all.
Exactly.
So
I've had lawyers who've advised their own relatives to go to the legal system, right? So you can
Yeah.
imagine a situation like this. The general feeling I get is, the biggest problem with all of these things is the fact that we have a failure of governance in this country, right? And that applies to everything. Had we had more, as you pointed out clearly before, female union leaders, which I have seen in other countries, and some of them I have even dealt with, so I know how strong they are and how they advocate and how they think differently. More female judges who are much more sensitive in understanding and taking cases and the procedures and enforcement and timelines and how they get the evidence. How do we, I think there's a whole IMF document on how to improve governance in this country, but in the absence of it being implemented, how do we go about doing it from our own perspectives, from a civil society perspective, from even from a governmental perspective, because this is the year of elections and we have two big ones. So hopefully governance can be addressed in some way.
We've been talking about it. We need to have more females in parliament and all of that, but it's not happening. So the problem is, I think, there are pros and cons for having quotas. The problem is, you can't pick a housewife and put that person in parliament because you want to have an effective parliamentarian as well.
And
somebody who is with skills
what they've been doing here is putting wives, girlfriends and widows
exactly.
In that quota.
So if you have a quota, what is going to happen? So the better thing to do is then to convince the people, like what I said earlier, that it is a smart thing to do. Half the population is female. You need to have female parliamentarians so they can, they will have a voice in parliament. The thing is, we don't have a level playing field, Majority of the parliamentarians are males.
And old
so they
and
are
pale.
not going to willingly, and then they have all their fraternities, how they choose, how they come up with the nomination lists and all of that. They are not going to willingly put in females. So I believe, at least in the short term, you need to have that quota. Otherwise, it's not going to work. But in saying that, I'm also not saying that you need to bring in these housewives into the parliament. A pipeline where you actually groom, facilitate women leaders, at the local levels, at junior management level, senior management level, give them space, give them role models. So that some of what is being done also at the moment in the corporate sector in Sri Lanka also to have this pipeline, to have more women directors. I think we need to do that in the general society, general firms as well, so that we have a pool of skilled women who are ready to go into parliament. So I think we need to do probably both.
Yeah. Final question to Aarthy. I think we look to the IFC as a global player in this space. Everyone wants to work with them. Everybody wants the investment, and I think we are looking for case studies and stories from IFC of where these have been successfully implemented, so that hopefully we can adopt them as well.
Sure. I'm not going to speak from a government sector perspective, and I'll always come in from the private sector. So it's definitely soft and progressive quotas is the way forward. And at the beginning, you will see that there'll be more family-oriented representation that's going to be on boards, and that's fine, because at least that's a start.
Yes.
Because there's going to be two sides of the coin. Some will say, no, this is not acceptable. Some will say you have to give more opportunities. But then where is the baseline? Right? I think we need to have a baseline first, and then you kind of progressively come on board. And there's a lot of work that really needs to be done. But I think for Sri Lanka, a lot has been done, from building a pipeline, as Nisha was talking about, and bringing the regulators and also lots of local partners together in one room and working together. Other than that, I think we've spoken a lot about building leaders, leadership training, mentorship and all that. I think we need to shift a little bit more on sponsorship. Are leaders willing to take those big bets on talent and put the women on like leadership roles despite of not having the skills, capabilities, and the background, versus you give that opportunity, you give that freedom to fail, you give that freedom to make success out of it, right? Versus how you would do it with another male colleague. So I think those are the kind of big bets are the organization really tying to. Are they willing to do it? We've seen a lot of MNCs, especially MNC CEOs, who have successfully, women CEOs who have successfully gone through this. And yeah, I think that'll be a great start.
Thank you. Fascinating chat. Thank you for your time, Aarthy, Nisha, and Nishana. If we have inspired even a small number of people who actually go and, take action, I think we are on the road, particularly in this year where we have multiple elections. And I do see a lot more younger people involved who see this as a major issue, right? As I think Mao Zedong said, women hold up half the universe, and I think it's about time they did the same in the workforce in this country as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation.
Yes.